Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little less philosophical, but no less fascinating. You're standing just outside the swinging doors of a Wild West saloon. Boots coated in dust, air thick with the kind of dryness that clings to your tongue. The sun's sinking, the light outside golden and forgiving. But as you step forward into that shaded, noisy den of whiskey and worn-out piano tunes, something unexpected slams into you. Not a cowboy, not a table, but the smell. You thought it'd be meat, maybe sizzling steak or warm bread. You were wrong. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, why not drop a comment below with where you're listening from and what time it is right now? It's always amazing to see how far this little time machine reaches. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You don't hear the piano first. You don't see the bar. You don't even notice the high-stakes poker game happening in the corner with a man who may or may not be cheating using his toe. No. The first thing that hits you the moment those swinging doors creak open is a wall of scent so powerful it nearly staggers you backwards. It's not the romantic kind of kitchen smell you're picturing. There's no waft of fresh cornbread or roasted meat. Instead, your nostrils are immediately overwhelmed by something that feels like an entire ecosystem trapped in one building. Picture this sweat-soaked wool, stale tobacco chewed to pulp and spat, beer that's soaked into the floorboards for months, and the unmistakable tang of animals' horses, mostly who haven't known the touch of water beyond the occasional rainstorm. And beneath all of that, maybe, just maybe, the faint, timid whisper of something. Cooking, but it's shy. It knows its place. You wrinkle your nose, instinctively pulling your bandana up like some kind of olfactory defense shield. It doesn't help. The smell is too complex, layered like a tragic lasagna of the senses. And yet, this is the norm. No one inside flinches. They're used to it. They've surrendered. You look down at the floor. Sawdust, not because it's stylish, but because it soaks up spit blood. And whatever unidentifiable liquid leaks from cracked boots and busted mugs. Some barkeeps even toss cigar ashes across the ground like seasoning, giving the place an added bouquet of burnt regret. Over at the counter, a massive man with forearms like tree trunks casually swats flies with a rag that hasn't seen soap since the gold rush. He wipes the same spot again and again. Flies return. It's a ritual now. A dance. You don't come here for the air. He grunts without looking at you. That rag. It used to be white. You're not sure what color it is now. Mushroom gray, stain brown. You stop trying to guess. This, right here, is how your journey into Wild West cuisine begins, not with taste, but with tolerance. It's not about eating what you love. It's about loving that you're eating. Full stop. The menu, if you can call it that, doesn't live behind glass or on printed cards. It lives in the barkeep's memory, slightly warped, and in the cook's mood decided somewhere between hangover and outright disdain. You sit down anyway, because your stomach doesn't care. It growls, loudly. The man next to you, some miner covered in a glimmer of gold dust and hopelessness, doesn't flinch. He just slides you an empty tin cup like a peace offering. You take it, you nod. In this world, there's a quiet agreement among strangers. No one asks what's in the stew. You eat what arrives. You chew what doesn't bite back. Let's break it down. Historically speaking, saloons weren't restaurants. They were sanctuaries for the tired, the drunk, the lost, the hopeful. Some doubled as boarding houses, brothels, barbershops, or even makeshift banks. And food was something you endured until you could justify your next drink. The meals were cooked out back or wherever they could stash a fire pit, and ingredients were whatever they could get that week. That might mean beef, might mean squirrel. It definitely meant beans. Lots and lots of beans. But we'll get to that later. Right now, you're still sitting at the bar, eyes watering slightly, trying to adjust not just to the atmosphere, but to the reality of it. And as a man with a fiddle stumbles through a melody that sounds vaguely like, "Oh, Susanna," being strangled, you realize something else. There's no silence here, just layers of noise, smells, and sensation. A blend so rich, you could bottle it and sell it as Wild West Ode to Oh No. Across the room, a young cowboy face too smooth to have seen a real gunfight orders food with a shrug. He's not even curious about what he'll get. That's the game. Trust the cook and hope it doesn't come back up later. He gets handed a metal plate. It steams slightly. He pokes it. It doesn't move. Encouraged, he digs in. You glance back toward the kitchen. There's no door, just a curtain stained with grease and hope. Behind it, you catch a glimpse of the cook. Just one. He's big. He's shirtless. He's chopping something that looks suspiciously like tree bark or a boot heel. He doesn't see you. Or maybe he does and just doesn't care. Here's the wild bit. Historians still argue whether Wild West saloons genuinely cared about food quality, or whether they just slapped something edible on a plate and focused their energy on booze and brawls. There are accounts, some probably exaggerated, of certain saloons in places like Deadwood or Tombstone hiring full-time cooks who took pride in their menu. And by pride, we mean they added a pinch of salt and stirred twice, but just as many travelers wrote about their regret. One diary entry from a man heading west in 1872 simply read, "Ate something warm, still alive. Consider this a victory." And you start to get it. As you sit there, tin cup in hand, soaking in the atmosphere like a sponge soaks whiskey off a bar counter, you understand that the saloon experience isn't about the food at all. It's about resilience. You weren't supposed to enjoy your meal. You were supposed to survive it. You were supposed to leave that table slightly fuller, slightly warmer, and hopefully without having contracted something unpronounceable. And so, you wait. You place your order. You pray quietly, internally, the way one prays before jumping off a cliff or eating something labeled chef's surprise. And when your plate arrives, steaming and oddly colored, you grip your fork like a weapon, because in the Wild West, every meal could be your last, or worse, it could be your second. You sit at the splintered table now, half watching the piano man in the corner who plays with all the grace of a mule in a dress. The candlelight flickers just enough to illuminate your plate, if you can call it that. It's more of a warped tin tray, dented and slightly rusted around the edges, like it's seen a few too many stampedes and survived a bar fight or three. And sitting next to you, a stranger. Not the friendly kind. He's got the look of a man who's been mining for 10 years and only found misery. His beard contains its own weather system. He doesn't say hello. He just nods, eyes on your food like it owes him money. You're not sure if he's going to rob you, bless you, or ask to marry your spoon, but you nod back. Because this is the code of the saloon. No small talk, no judgments. Just unspoken treaties between hungry, tired souls trying not to die before dessert. You stab the first bite with your fork. It resists. A chunk of something, possibly pork, possibly regret. You chew, It tastes like warm. That's the only word your brain offers. Not seasoned, not savory, just not cold. Across the room, someone coughs loud enough to shake the whiskey glasses. Someone else laughs like he's been possessed. The barkeep wipes the same section of counter again, and here you are eating, chewing, occasionally wondering if your teeth are strong enough for whatever that last bite was. This is dinner in the Wild West. Meals here don't operate like meals at home. There's no appetizer, no main course, no lovingly handcrafted presentation. The saloon serves what it has, what was available that morning, what didn't run away fast enough, what fell off the supply wagon and didn't rot entirely. You might be wondering, how did anyone survive this? Easy. They didn't come here for food. They came for warmth, for the sound of other humans after months alone, for the illusion of safety behind swinging doors, and for the slim chance of a hot plate. Even if that plate was aggressively mediocre, the man beside you finally speaks. Last time I ate here, the stew winked at me. He says, deadpan. You pause. He doesn't smile. You're not sure if it's a joke or a warning. This is the gamble of saloon dining. You sit beside strangers with unknown pasts and unknowable futures. The man across from you might offer you a piece of bread or a bullet. He might hold the door open for you tomorrow, or hold your wallet and ride off into the sunrise. It's communal in the most unpredictable sense, but somehow, there's comfort in that unpredictability. You know the rules. You eat fast. You don't ask what's in the food. And you never, ever insult the cook, especially if he's bigger than your horse and angrier than your stomach. The barkeep brings over another plate. This one for the stranger. You glance over. It looks the same. Beige stew. Something floating. Possibly edible. He doesn't hesitate. He digs in like he hasn't eaten in 3 days. Maybe he hasn't. You realize then in this world, everyone's one meal away from becoming the villain in someone else's story. Let's zoom out a moment. Historically, saloons were the meeting ground of all walks of life: ranchers, gamblers, lawmen, outlaws, drifters, and food was the great equalizer. No matter how many gold nuggets you had stuffed in your boot or how many wanted posters bore your name, you all sat at the same stained table. You all prayed to the same stew pot. You all wiped your mouths with the same rag that had been cleaned by simply shaking it out back. Some saloons offered more formal dining setups, actual tables. Maybe menus scribbled in charcoal on boards, but most were improvisational symphonies of necessity. One pot, one ladle, one chance at satisfaction. And yet, it worked. Because what you really came here for wasn't the food. It was the moment. The ritual. Sitting down in a warm room after days on the trail. The sound of laughter that didn't come from coyotes. The light that didn't flicker like a dying star. The food that was just there, and if it didn't make you sick, that was considered gourmet. Back at your table, the stranger's done. His plate's clean. How was it, you ask? Against your better judgment. He licks his spoon. Didn't bite back this time, he says, and leaves. You wonder how many times the stew has bitten someone. You also wonder if you're next. This is what dining in the Wild West teaches you: humility. You stop expecting flavor. You start appreciating heat, weight, and the fact that your stomach isn't currently staging a revolt. It's not a meal. It's a ceasefire. Some nights, the saloon ran out of food entirely. Maybe a shipment didn't arrive. Maybe the cook left in a huff after someone called his squirrel pie bland. On those nights, dinner was bread and whiskey, or just whiskey, or just pretending you weren't hungry until you passed out. The people who made it through those nights, they learned to treat every warm bite like a blessing, even if it was chewy, even if it came with fur. You didn't eat because you trusted the ingredients. You ate because you trusted that someone else already did and survived. Historians still debate just how rough Wild West saloon cuisine really was. Some say it was exaggerated in journals and dime novels. Others argue those writers held back out of decency. But what's universally agreed upon, the food wasn't why you stayed. It was who you sat beside. It was the stories you heard while chewing on something vaguely bean-adjacent. The laughter that shook the walls when someone finally told a joke that landed. The collective sigh when someone brave enough tried the stew first and didn't fall over. And maybe, just maybe, the look of gratitude in the cook's eyes if you ever saw him when someone asked for seconds. You push your plate away. You're full, not in the modern sense, but in the I probably won't starve tonight kind of way. Someone at the bar begins to sing. Badly. But it's music. Real music. A harmonica joins in. The night wears on. The smell never really fades. It just becomes part of the background noise. Like the creaking chairs or the occasional gunshot outside. And you sit a little longer. You sip whatever's in your cup. You feel the warmth settle in your belly and spread through your limbs. Maybe it was the stew. Maybe it was the company. But for now, in this flickering corner of the Wild West, you're not just surviving. You're living. You wake up hungry again. Your head's a little foggy, not from drink, but from the kind of sleep that only comes after forcing down something vaguely meat-adjacent. You stretch, wince at the crick in your back, and drag yourself out into the morning chill. Boots thudding against the warped wooden floorboards of the saloon. It's early, the kind of early where the sun isn't fully committed yet, just peeking over the dry horizon like it's deciding whether to show up for work. You squint toward the kitchen. Someone's already up. There's the dull clank of iron, the sizzle of something in a pan, and the unmistakable scent of beans. Again. Welcome to the culinary cornerstone of the Wild West, the bean. You probably weren't hoping for beans again. But in the Wild West, hope is a currency that doesn't spend well. The humble bean didn't just show up on your plate because it was cheap. It showed up because it was bulletproof. Figuratively, and maybe even literally. If the saloon caught fire, the beans would be the only thing left. Sitting in a blackened pot, smug and indestructible. There's something admirable about that kind of resilience. Beans didn't rot. They didn't spoil in saddlebags. They didn't complain when you overcooked them. They just existed, patient little nutritional grenades, waiting for boiling water and a pinch of salt to become not deadly. They weren't flavorful, but they were filling, like gravel for your gut. And they had range. You could boil them, mash them, fry them, bake them. You could pretend they were meat if you closed your eyes hard enough and squinted at your plate through a whiskey glass. One cowboy reportedly called beans trail treasure. But he also ate them with a spoon he carved out of bone. So we'll take his culinary opinion with a grain of saloon dust. Still, beans were a symbol of poverty. Sure, but also of perseverance. You didn't eat them because you were poor. You ate them because you were still here. Historically, beans were abundant and easy to transport. Dried and stored in burlap sacks. They could last years if kept dry. You could haul them across deserts, rivers, and mountain passes without worrying about spoilage. Ranchers and railroad workers bought them in bulk, literal barrels of the stuff because they knew the value of a meal that didn't betray you by turning green overnight. And out west, betrayal came in many forms. Back at your table, a tin plate clinks down. Beans again. This time, with a bonus, a chunk of something grayish-brown floating in the center like a meat-flavored island. You poke it. It jiggles slightly. You decide not to ask. This is bean country, after all. There's a rhythm to bean life. You eat them. You regret them. You forget them. And then you eat them again. Like a painful romance you can't quit. The beans don't taste better over time, you just stop caring. Some cooks got fancy. Added onion, molasses, or even a crusty bit of salt pork for flavor. Others just scooped from the pot, muttered a warning, and moved on. Either way, you chewed, you swallowed, you survived. Now, here's a quirky little fact. Some saloons served spicy beans not for flavor, but to slow the drinking. The heat made patrons gulp water or more beer, which, in theory, kept them from passing out after one shot of whiskey. It didn't work. But it did make everyone sweat, which conveniently masked the smell of unwashed humanity. Multitasking, Wild West style. You shift in your seat. Your stomach is settling. Sort of. Beans expand, you know, like guilt or frontier debt. Across from you, a young drifter leans back, arms behind his head. He's got that bean-blessed look, mild discomfort mixed with grim satisfaction. This, he says, is the food of legends. You raise an eyebrow? Not because it's good, he adds, because it never dies. Beans were the edible background noise of frontier life. They simmered in pots at all hours. You could hear them bubbling behind the bar, beneath the sounds of boots and broken dreams. Some cowboys claimed they could tell the time of day by the smell of the beans. Morning beans smelled hopeful. Afternoon beans smelled resigned. Evening beans smelled like smoke and surrender. And midnight beans were only for the desperate or the drunk. There's a legend probably invented over a round of poker and questionable liquor about a saloon that served only beans. No drinks, no music, no women. Just beans. In 12 different pots, each one older than the last. You'd walk in, choose your pot by aroma or instinct, and sit in silence with the other tortured souls chewing their way through time. It might be a lie, but if it's not, you kinda respect it. Historians still argue whether the bean obsession was purely logistical, or if it carried some deeper symbolism for the frontier. Was it merely a matter of supply chains and salted sacks? Or was it a quiet nod to the persistence of the human spirit? Probably both. The Wild West wasn't built on steak and wine. It was built on beans and the guts to choke them down. And so, you finish your plate. You scrape the last bits up with your crust of bread. You stare at the bottom of the tin, wondering if your stomach has room or if it will declare mutiny by sundown. You'll know soon enough. Outside, the wind shifts. Dust kicks up across the empty street. Somewhere, a horse neighs, and a gambler shouts in victory or rage. Hard to tell the difference. But inside the saloon, the pot bubbles on. The beans keep cooking, and the people keep eating. Because in a world where everything else can fail your horse, your aim, your luck beans never do. They may not nourish the soul, but they do keep the body moving. And out here, that's good enough. The thing about salt pork is that it doesn't care if you like it. It doesn't care about your dreams of bacon, your yearning for soft fat that melts in your mouth, or your romantic notions of meat that doesn't squeak between your teeth. Salt pork is not here to be enjoyed. It is here to endure. And if you want to eat it, you'd better be prepared to meet it on its terms. This morning, it's been diced and tossed into the bean pot again. You spot the shimmering, translucent cubes floating like stubborn survivors. They glisten not in the seductive way of caramelized bacon, but more in the I've been in this brine barrel since last spring kind of way. And you chew, because there's no other meat on offer. Salt pork, in its raw state, looks like a slab of fat that's seen things. thick, rubbery, occasionally streaked with some lucky muscle fiber. It came from the belly of the pig. But the pig didn't die with dreams of glory, just practicality. Once salted, and we're talking heavily salted, it was crammed into barrels with enough brine to preserve a fleet. Sailors took it to sea. Soldiers took it to war. And out here, cowboys took it into the dust and distance of the American frontier. It didn't rot. That was its claim to fame. You could forget about a slab of it in the bottom of your saddlebag, rediscover it 6 months later, and it would smell exactly the same. Not better, just unchanged. You hear the barkeep call out? Salt pork's tender today. This is suspicious. Nothing about salt pork is ever tender. It's either chewy like punishment or crispy like regret. Tender is not in its vocabulary. Still, it's food, or it used to be, and in a saloon where the menu depends on who didn't show up at the butcher this week. Salt pork counts as luxury. You gnaw thoughtfully, thinking about how this block of meat could probably stop a bullet. In fact, it might have. Some cowboys used to joke that carrying salt pork in your breast pocket was better than a Bible. One saved your soul. The other saved your heart literally. It was greasy, sure, but grease was currency out here. It kept your skillet slick, your boots oiled, and your lips from cracking in the desert wind. And the taste? Well, it tasted like the salt. The fat was there mostly to confuse your mouth, to give the illusion of richness. If you were lucky, it was smoked. If not, it was just dense, like biting into salted clay with ambition. There's a legendary tale of a cook in Arizona who once tenderized salt pork by wrapping it in a wet bandana, tucking it under his saddle, and riding 20 miles. The constant jostling supposedly broke down the fibers. When they unwrapped it, it was indeed softer. It also smelled like horse. But hey, no one died. That's success out here. Back in the saloon, a prospector with dirt in his ears and gold dust in his eyelashes slaps a thick coin on the bar. "Give me the salt pork," he growls, like he's issuing a challenge. The barkeep hands it over. No side dish, just meat on a plate. He eats it with a knife. No fork, no napkin, just experience. You watch him chew with the quiet awe of someone observing a man bite a stone and win. You take another bite yourself. It squeaks. Your molars protest. But eventually, it gives. Salt pork always does. Just not willingly. Historically, salt pork was a survival cornerstone. The U.S. Army rationed it. Explorers hoarded it. Homesteaders layered it into every stew, every soup, every desperate attempt at something warm. It wasn't bacon, but it did the job. And cowboys pretended it was bacon. They'd slice it thin, throw it on a fire until it crisped, and squint at it like maybe it was breakfast in a dream. They called it camp bacon, laughed about it, and chewed like their teeth owed them money. The sad truth: salt pork doesn't get better with age. It just waits. You once read about a saloon that used salt pork in every dish on the menu. Beans with salt pork, bread fried in pork grease, salt pork stew, pork fat pie. They were famous, also mildly feared, but their patrons loyal, because in the Wild West, flavor was optional, longevity was king, and salt pork, that was royalty. Historians still debate just how common salt pork really was. Some argue it was a fallback, not a favorite. Others say it was the backbone of cowboy cuisine. After all, meat that doesn't rot, doesn't spoil, and doesn't complain is a rare treasure. One thing they do agree on: nobody ever wrote a love poem about it. Your plate is empty now. You're full in that heavy, greasy way that makes you want a nap under a poker table. You lean back, listening to the saloon sounds, the clink of mugs, the low murmur of gossip, the occasional slap of a losing hand. Outside, the wind stirs again. Somewhere, a dog barks once and stops, like it thought better of it. And you're surviving, one squeaky bite at a time. Because out here, meat doesn't need to be tender. It just needs to not kill you. You've learned by now that in a Wild West saloon, trust is a form of insanity. Still, you sit at the table, spoon in hand, staring at your stew. It doesn't look particularly deadly. It's steaming, which is encouraging. It has chunks of something. Possibly meat. Possibly not. You poke it gently. One of the chunks bobs, as if offended. You're not alone in your skepticism. The man across from you is inspecting his bowl with the wary expression of someone who's been bitten by soup before, and yet both of you raise your spoons. Because you're hungry, and because stew in the Wild West was a gamble you were expected to take daily. This is not the kind of stew with rosemary sprigs and fresh thyme. This is the stew of necessity boiled hard, stirred slow, and made from whatever didn't escape the saloon's yard that morning. If it moved and could be cooked, it might be in here. Squirrel definitely, rabbit often, rattlesnake only, if it had already stopped moving. There's a story about a traveler who claimed he found a boot string in his stew and wasn't even upset. It was the most chewable part. He reportedly said, "You get it now. You take your first bite." The texture is mysterious. It's tender in places, rubbery in others. You hit something with a bit of snap. You choose not to look, because the rule of stew in this part of the world is simple. If the cook looks nervous and the neighborhood dogs have recently gone missing, eat around the chewy bits and say nothing. This is what passes for etiquette. Historically, stew was the perfect disguise. You could throw in almost anything gristle, offcuts, mystery meat, and as long as it boiled long enough, it became dinner. It allowed saloons to stretch small quantities of protein across a crowd of hungry mouths, and people didn't ask, because the truth might ruin the illusion. Let's talk about meat quality, or more accurately, the absence of it. In towns with butchers, you might get lucky. The stew might actually contain beef, real beef, from an animal that had a name and a history, and maybe a little dignity. But in most places, you got meat, the kind you didn't ask about. It could be venison, or mule, or coyote. If it wasn't barking, squawking, or clearly decomposing, they got chopped up and added to the pot. Some cooks got creative. Some did not. There's a tale of a saloon stew that used bones as flavoring. Not marrow bones, just bones. Customers had to fish them out, suck what they could, and move on. The meat was a suggestion, not a promise. And you know what? No one complained. Because in the Wild West, complaining about stew was like yelling at a dust storm. Pointless, dangerous, and likely to get you shot or worse, cut off from the pot. Your spoon scoops up a piece of potato. Soft, a little mealy, but actual vegetable content. A rare sighting. You glance up, hopeful. Someone else found a sliver of carrot and is holding it up like buried treasure. Vegetables were rare. When available, they were used sparingly, more as a gesture than nutrition. If you found 3 peas in your stew, it was considered a luxury, a green miracle, and the broth thin, oily, barely clinging to flavor, but hot and heat in this world is a kind of mercy you chew on, slowly, respectfully. The stew gets better the deeper you go, either because the flavors have settled or because your tongue has surrendered. You start to wonder about the cook. He's still back there, stirring with a spoon the size of a canoe paddle, probably sweating into the pot, probably daring anyone to ask what's in it. There's no menu, just stew, always stew. It's the one dish that never runs out, never changes, never apologizes. And here's the kicker: historians still debate whether Wild West stew was ever intended to be nutritious. Some believe it was simply a way to keep people quiet and seated while they drank. Others argue it was a deliberate effort to provide calories in a lawless world. Either way, it worked. Stew gave people something to gather around, something to distract them from their dusty boots and aching joints. And sometimes it gave them a reason to survive another day. A woman walks in with 2 kids trailing behind her. They sit at the far table. The barkeep serves them each a bowl. The kids stare at it with the same expression you had wary hope. They eat anyway, because stew is universal. It crosses boundaries of age, money, morality. Everyone eats it. Everyone survives it. Everyone forgets the details by morning. You glance down at your bowl. There's 1 piece left. It's dark, slightly stringy, and smells okay. You hesitate. Then you eat it. And it's fine. Not good. Not terrible. Just fine. And in the Wild West, that's a miracle. They say the stew never stops cooking, that the pot is never truly emptied, just topped off day after day, week after week. The flavor builds like a legend. Every bite contains whispers of 100 meals before it. This might be myth, or it might be the most authentic flavor profile in history. One man's beef, another man's badger, all in the same bowl. Outside, the wind howls. The day is sliding into that dusky gray, where shadows stretch long and tempers grow short. Inside, the stew simmers. The barkeep refills your bowl without asking. You nod. He nods. And you dig in again. Because even if it's a mystery, it's your mystery now. And out here, that's as close to comfort as you'll ever get. Hardtack doesn't want to be eaten. It wants to be survived. It sits on your plate like a dare this block of baked flour and spite. Baked until even termites walk away shaking their heads. You pick it up. It's heavy. Not just dense, but philosophically heavy. Like it carries the weight of every bad decision that led you to this meal. You rap it against the table. It knocks twice. The table winces. Hardtack was never supposed to be food. It was designed more as edible architecture. The blueprint was simple: mix flour and water. Shape it into something vaguely square. Then bake it until even the heat gives up. No salt, no leavening, no love. It was originally made for sailors and soldiers. People with limited space, no refrigeration, and absolutely no time for spoilage. Out in the Wild West, that made it perfect. Why? Because it never went bad. It barely began. You try biting into it. Your teeth recoil like startled horses. You try again. Still no progress. Someone once described hardtack as eating the corner of a bookshelf. You now realize they were being generous. This is not food. This is persistence in biscuit form. So what did people do? They adapted. Step 1, inspect. Because hardtack, despite its resilience, had one weakness: bugs. Weevils, specifically. Little beetly passengers that took up residence in the tiny air pockets of the biscuit. Cowboys would tap them on the table to knock the insects out. If the bugs crawled, that meant the biscuit was fresh. If they didn't, you got extra crunch. Step 2, soak. Hardtack on its own could break a molar. But dunk it into stew, coffee, or desperate times whiskey, and it would soften enough to chew without dental casualties. Sometimes it took a while. There's a rumor of one cowboy who dropped his hardtack into a mug and left it for a full hour. Came back, took a bite and chipped a tooth on a pebble inside the biscuit. You can't win, but you can gnaw. In some parts of the frontier, Cooks tried to liven it up. They'd fry it in pork grease, soak it in molasses, or crumble it into soup. These methods turned hardtack from something that actively hated your mouth into something just mildly resentful. And that was considered progress. There's an old joke in mining camps: you don't bite hardtack, it bites you. It's funny because it's true, and because humor is the only seasoning it ever had. Historically, hardtack was mass-produced during the Civil War. Union soldiers carried bags of it. Some etched their names into the surface like edible dog tags. Others tossed it at rats. A few, desperate and resourceful, used it as playing cards. It was versatile, if not palatable. And out west, it was standard. Even saloons kept it around, stored in barrels or baskets near the stove, waiting for someone foolish or famished enough to ask for bread. You didn't toast it. You warned people about it. There's one saloon tale, possibly exaggerated, but too good to ignore, about a poker player who bet his last piece of hardtack in a game. When he lost, the winner bit into it, cracked a molar, and sued. He lost. The judge reportedly said, "Shoulda soaked it first. You dunk your piece in coffee now. It fizzes slightly. That's probably not good." You wait, stir, wait longer. Eventually, it softens just enough to break apart with a spoon. You taste it. It's not terrible. It's also not good, but it's warm. It's heavy. It takes up space in your stomach like a stone in a well, which, at this point, is all you're asking for. Historians still argue whether hardtack was a culinary solution or a cultural surrender. Did people eat it out of ingenuity or pure desperation? Was it a proud symbol of frontier grit or just an accident that refused to leave? Either way, it persisted. Like dust, like taxes, like that one guy in town who swears he saw a coyote playing harmonica. You finish the last bite with a grimace. Or maybe a smile. It's hard to tell. Your jaw is sore. Your stomach is full. And you've earned the right to say you endured something. At the next table, a cowboy eyes your plate. "Still got your teeth?" he asks. You nod. He chuckles. Then it wasn't real hardtack. You lean back in your chair as the sun begins to slip behind the distant ridgeline. The air inside the saloon cools slightly. Mugs clink. Cards shuffle. Someone shouts "cheat," but no one moves. And beside the fire, the cook drops another tray of hardtack near the coals. He doesn't look at anyone. He knows what he's done, and he'll do it again. Because the West wasn't one with guns and glory. It was one with grit, grease, and a biscuit that could outlive us all. The saloon feels quieter this evening, though it's not really. The piano is still off-key. The poker table still hosts the same suspects shuffling fate with stained cards. And the barkeep is still wiping that same patch of counter like he's trying to erase time itself. But to you, it's quieter because your stomach's settled. Your body's warm, and you've started to adapt. You know what to expect now. Or at least, you think you do. Until you take your first sip of the coffee, it's like swallowing smoke. Thick, tar-like, almost chewable. It coats your tongue in bitterness that doesn't so much wake you up as remind you that life is hard and doesn't plan on changing. There's no aroma, no smooth, nutty finish, no playful acidity dancing on your palate. Just roasted regret. The man next to you coughs into his cup and grins, eyes watering. "Ain't bad tonight," he mutters. You can't tell if he's joking. Maybe he's just been here too long. Maybe his taste buds staged a walkout years ago. You set the cup down carefully, as if afraid it might fight back. Coffee in the Wild West wasn't a beverage. It was a lifestyle choice, a test of will and, occasionally, stomach lining. Made from grounds that had been boiled, reboiled, then boiled again for good measure. This brew wasn't filtered so much as strained through trauma. The longer it sat, the bolder it became. A full day on the fire turned it into a black potion of defiance, served thick as axle grease and with nearly the same medicinal effect. No cream, no sugar, unless you were one of the fancy folk. Some saloons had little tins of evaporated milk hidden behind the counter. If the barkeep liked you or pitied you, he might splash a spoonful in. It didn't improve the flavor, just changed the color from despair to pale despair. But it helped some cowboys pretend, just for a moment, that they were back home. Back where coffee came from something other than a dented tin pail scraped along the bottom. There are whispers of one saloon out in Nevada that reused the same grounds for 3 days straight. By the end, the coffee tasted like burned rope, wood ash, and a decision you couldn't undo. But it still sold, because no one was drinking it for the flavor. They were drinking it because, after 3 weeks on the trail, your only choices were coffee or sleeping with one eye open. There's something oddly poetic about that. Historians still argue whether these saloons intentionally brewed such horrifying coffee as a cost-saving tactic, or if the people behind the bar had simply lost the will to care. Some believe the bitterness had purpose to shock you into alertness, to keep you from overindulging in whiskey too early, to help your brain recalibrate after a meal of squirrel-flavored mystery stew. Others think it was just neglect, laziness, or sheer survivalism. Coffee was just another tool in the frontier kit. Functional, brutal, unforgiving. You take another sip. It hasn't improved. If anything, it feels angrier now, like it knows you hesitated. Still, it's hot. And that counts for something. You cradle the tin cup, letting the heat seep into your fingers. There's a kind of ritual comfort in it, the warmth, the weight, the way your hands close around something steady in a world that's constantly shifting. Out there, horses can bolt, friends can vanish, and tomorrow is a bet you're not sure you'll win. But in here, coffee is always terrible and always available. A small comfort, but a dependable one. There's an old cowboy saying you can trust a man who drinks his coffee black, because if he's lying, he's already punished himself. You chuckle softly at the memory. It's absurd. And yet, out here, it makes sense. Across the room, someone pours a fresh pot from a battered kettle. The liquid flows slowly, as if reluctant. The scent, if you can call it that, is something between charcoal and melted horseshoe. Someone drops a lump of sugar into their cup and stirs it with a fork. The granules vanish immediately, like they'd rather dissolve than stay in that brew any longer. You remember hearing once that soldiers during the Civil War would roast acorns when coffee ran out, grinding them into a bitter, smoky powder that mimicked the real thing. Some even used burned cornmeal. You wonder, briefly, what this saloon uses. Then you stop wondering. Some truths are best left in the shadows. The man next to you clears his throat. Got a kick, don't it? You nod. It does. The kind of kick that leaves a hoofprint on your soul. And yet, you keep drinking, not because it tastes good, but because it matters. Because in a land built on dry heat, worn boots, and miles of empty horizon, a cup of something hot, anything hot, is a small act of rebellion. Against the cold, against the silence, against the creeping weight of solitude that rides behind every saddle. It's not about pleasure, it's about presence. You are here, you are still upright, and you are drinking. There's a strange power in that. Cowboys used to joke that the worse the coffee, the longer you lived. Maybe because your body refused to die until it finished processing it. Or maybe because bitterness had a way of preserving you from softness, from laziness, from the urge to give up. You look around the saloon now with new eyes. Every man here has faced something. Hunger, loneliness, loss. And somehow, this grim little beverage has been a thread between all of them. A shared punishment, a shared ritual. A few have even elevated it to art. You once met a cook, big hands, no neck, a voice like gravel who claimed he could make good coffee. You asked him what his secret was. He looked you dead in the eye and said, "Don't make it here." Fair enough. You finish the last drop. It sits in your stomach like a stone, but radiates a strange, stubborn warmth. You feel more awake. Not in the energetic, ready-to-wrangle cattle kind of way, but in the aware way. The way a man feels when he's just swallowed a lesson he didn't want to learn. Because out here, even the coffee has teeth, and it bites down hard. Some things on a saloon menu are predictable, like the eternal pot of beans or the murky mystery stew, but now and then, you get something that almost feels like kindness. A warm square of cornbread, golden and slightly cracked on top, arrives on your plate like an apology. And for a moment, you let yourself believe in small miracles. It crumbles at the edge of your fork, still warm, soft in the middle, crispy on the outside. The scent is faintly sweet cornmeal kissed by smoke and something vaguely resembling butter. You take a bite, and your mouth relaxes. It's not gourmet, but it's familiar, comforting. It reminds you of something. Maybe home, or at least the idea of it. Cornbread was the saloon's Swiss Army knife, simple to make, forgiving in texture, and adaptable to whatever the cook had on hand. Flour and cornmeal were staples that traveled well and spoiled slow. Add a dash of baking powder if you had it, a splash of milk or water, maybe a spoonful of lard, and suddenly you had bread. Not the crusty, yeasty loaves of big city bakeries, but bread nonetheless. And out here, that counted for everything. Cornbread didn't judge you. It didn't hide questionable chunks inside or fight your jaw for dominance. It just was a soft, quiet presence next to the chaos of salt pork and stew. Sometimes, if the cook was feeling generous or had a sweet tooth, you'd even get a cornbread with molasses drizzled on top. That was a holiday-level event. Something folks would remember, talk about for days, maybe even write a letter home about, ate something sweet today, didn't die, might be love. But just as often, cornbread was dry, crumbly, barely held together. Maybe it had been sitting out for 2 days under a rag that used to be a dishcloth. Maybe it had a weird texture because someone used horse feed instead of cornmeal. You didn't ask. You just ate it with slow gratitude. And then there were the eggs. If cornbread was a reliable friend, eggs were the traveling circus. Sometimes they showed up, sometimes they didn't. When they did, they were like guests you didn't trust. Shiny, inconsistent, slightly suspect. You could never be sure where the eggs came from. Chickens weren't always common in the frontier. They were cranky, high maintenance, and prone to disappearing overnight foxes, thieves, cooks. So when a saloon had eggs, it was a sign. Either they had their own chickens locked in some secret coop behind the kitchen, or they had a deal with someone a few towns over. Or maybe they were smuggling. What kind of eggs were they? That was the forbidden question. You might get chicken eggs. You might get duck eggs, and every once in a while, something else. Something unspoken. Eggs that were a little too large or too small, or the wrong color. You stopped asking? You ordered your eggs and took what came. If they were scrambled, you considered it a win, no identifiable features. If they were boiled, you prayed. If they were fried sunny side up, you inspected everything before diving in. There's a local legend of a cowboy who cracked open an egg and found twin yolks, slightly green. He called it a blessing and ate it with both hands. No one saw him for 3 days after. Some say he found religion. Others say he found a toilet and never left it. But that's the risk of frontier dining. Historians often debate the authenticity of eggs on saloon menus. Were they really that common? Or are we projecting our modern breakfast expectations onto a world that barely had the concept of morning routine? It's likely that eggs were rare, precious, sometimes borderline sacred. If you got them, it meant someone had risked something to bring them here. Maybe they paid good money. Maybe they bartered with bullets. Maybe they bribed a traveling preacher with whiskey and a promise of decent stew. Whatever the story, the eggs that made it to your plate had been through things, and if you were smart, you said thank you silently, but deeply before eating them. A man across from you picks up his cornbread, breaks it open, and nestles a runny egg inside. It spills slightly, golden yolk soaking into the warm, porous bread. He doesn't smile, but his shoulders drop, just a little, as if this small bite made the day a little more bearable. You mimic him, cornbread and egg. It's a strange kind of elegance, unlikely, unplanned, but somehow right. Like finding a dry patch of ground during the rainy season, or a saddle that doesn't squeak. It's enough, and in a world that asks so much of your body, your patience, your appetite, enough is a rare and valuable thing. The cook comes out of the back for a moment, wiping his hands on his apron, eyes sweeping the room like a hawk sizing up potential threats. He sees plates emptying. No one's dead or vomiting. He nods to himself. Maybe that was his version of a smile. You get the feeling that if you complimented the cornbread, he'd hit you with a ladle. So you don't. You just finish your meal, quietly thankful, because today you got eggs, and they didn't fight back. The pie arrives like it doesn't belong here. It's the one dish in the saloon that feels like it came from another world, one with gingham curtains and whistling mothers and sunlit windowsills. The crust is flaky, golden, a little uneven. Someone tried. That alone makes it special. You stare at it for a second longer than usual, unsure how this piece of warmth snuck into a world built on bullets, grit, and boiled sorrow. But there it is, sitting before you like a whispered promise. And before you can overthink it, you take a bite. It crumbles softly under your fork, the crust giving way to a filling that's sweet but subtle. Apple, maybe. Or rhubarb. Or something that used to be fruit, before it made the long journey west in a dented tin can. You can't tell. You don't care, because it's pie. And in the Wild West, that's like finding gold between your teeth. Pie wasn't a staple in saloons. It wasn't on the menu, if such a thing even existed. Pie happened when the cook had time, ingredients, and a moment of grace. It was the culinary version of a shooting star blink, and you miss it. But if you were lucky enough to catch it, you remembered it forever. Some saloons used pie as a lure, a competitive edge in a dusty town where every watering hole had whiskey and cards. But not everyone had the luxury of dessert. A good pie could pull customers from 2 towns over. A warm pie that could start a knife fight. There's a story passed down in whispers about a man who threatened to shoot the barkeep over the last slice of berry pie. He claimed it was the first thing that had made him feel alive in 6 years. The barkeep gave him the slice. The room gave him space. No one judged him. Pie does that to people. This particular slice is imperfect. The crust is uneven, and the filling threatens to leak out the sides, like it's trying to escape the plate. But that only makes it more real, more human. You eat slowly, deliberately, because you don't know when this will happen again. Someone behind you asks if there's more. The cook shouts back, "One per customer. Fight over it outside." No one moves, but everyone looks. That's how rare pie is. It stops time, commands respect, unites and divides in equal measure. Even in its simplest form, flour, fat, a spoonful of sugar pie has power. It's not just food, it's a memory of a home you left behind, of a mother or grandmother who used to hum while kneading dough, of quiet mornings and full bellies. Things you traded for the thrill or desperation of the frontier. You once heard about a saloon that tried to serve pie every Sunday. The owner said it kept people civil. They don't shoot each other with jam on their shirts, he'd explain. It worked, mostly. They used canned fruit, whatever they could get their hands on: peaches, cherries, even mashed raisins. The crust was lard-based, heavy and solid, more defense than delicacy. But it was still pie, and people showed up, dirty, tired, covered in saddle dust and soot. But they came, because for that one afternoon, they could pretend that they lived in a gentler world. Historians still debate whether pies in the Wild West were actually common or just a modern invention romanticizing the era. Most agree they were rare. Luxuries, symbols of effort and excess in a land that offered neither. But when they appeared, they mattered, not because of taste, but because of what they meant. You finish the last bite and scrape your fork along the plate for the stubborn crumbs. Even that feels indulgent. You don't want to waste a single fragment of kindness. Across the room, a man offers to trade his tobacco for someone's slice. No one takes him up on it. Not even the desperate. Because nothing out here is worth more than dessert. Pie reminded people they were still human. When your meals consist of beans, boot leather pork, and coffee thick enough to pave a road. A slice of fruit pie is a rebellion. A quiet one. No gunshots. Just a flaky crust and a moment of sweetness. And sometimes, that's enough to keep you going. You wipe your mouth, lean back, and sigh. You're not full. Not exactly. But you feel better. A little more whole. A little more willing to face the next dry mile. The next empty horizon. And you understand why someone once said, there are two kinds of people in the world. The ones who eat pie when it's offered, and the ones who regret it forever. You, thankfully, are the first kind. At first glance, the cheese doesn't look like much. A pale, slightly waxy wedge pressed into a dull metal dish, dusted with what might be pepper, or might be something that fell off the shelf. The edges are cracked, the surface leathery, and the smell, well, let's just say it doesn't apologize for existing. And yet, the man next to you stares at it, like it's treasure. He takes a bite, grimaces, and nods with what almost seems like approval. You follow suit. The flavor hits immediately sharp, salty, strangely bitter, with a finish like old boots left out in the rain. It tastes like something that used to be alive and hasn't entirely let go of that identity. You chew slowly, uncertain whether to swallow or surrender. Welcome to cheese in the Wild West. This isn't the creamy brie of Paris or the aged cheddar of England. This is cheese made by someone who had a cow, a dream, and no refrigeration. It's dense, survivalist, a little angry, and in a saloon where half the food tastes like mystery and the other half like resignation. Cheese stood out, not because it was delicious, but because it was civilized. Out on the frontier, cheese wasn't common. It required milk, and milk required cows, and cows were walking currency. Keeping one alive in a land filled with thieves, drought, and the occasional wandering cougar was an achievement in itself. So if a saloon had cheese, it meant something. It meant the owner had a connection, a farm, a deal, a secret stash. It was a power move, an edible flex. Most of the cheese wasn't fresh. Of course, it couldn't be. It was dry, aged in cellars or tucked into root houses, wrapped in cloth or wax or nothing at all. Sometimes it was coated in ash or pepper to keep the bugs off or distract from the bugs that made it through. There's a tale of a traveling merchant who once bought cheese in Nevada. Said it tasted like boiled socks with a rind. He ate the whole thing, because even bad cheese was still cheese. And out here, that meant dignity. You chew another bite. It resists at first, then yields with a kind of gritty collapse. The flavor deepens, still strange, but oddly compelling. You don't exactly like it, but you respect it, much like the men and women who made it. Cheese making out here wasn't a hobby. It was labor. You milked the cow at dawn, strained the curds by hand, aged them wherever was cool enough not to kill the process. There were no thermometers, no timers, just instinct and luck. And if you did everything right, you got a block of something solid, nourishing, and pungent enough to keep your neighbors guessing. That was success. Some cooks tried to get creative. There were reports of cheeses mixed with herbs, rolled in cracked peppercorns, or pressed into shapes with old tin molds. Most of these experiments ended in disappointment. One infamous batch was described as cheese-flavored regret with a crunchy surprise. No one asked what the surprise was. And then there were the imports. Yes, even out west. A few fancy saloons tried bringing in European cheeses, usually by rail, packed in straw and prayers. They arrived half-melted, often leaking, always suspicious. But they sold, because they were exotic, and because sometimes a man would pay anything to taste a bite of something he remembered from childhood, even if that taste had curdled a bit in transit. Historians still argue whether cheese in saloons was truly valued for its flavor or simply its rarity. Some say it was nostalgia in solid form. Others claim it was protein with a side of identity. Either way, it mattered. Cheese was a statement. It said, we're not animals. Not entirely. You look down at the last piece on your plate. The crust has dried. The center glistens faintly in the lantern light. You hesitate, then pop it in your mouth. It tastes better, or maybe your tongue has just surrendered to the concept. The man across from you catches your eye. He lifts his own wedge in a silent toast. You lift yours in return. In a land where nothing is guaranteed water, safety, kindness, this quiet moment of shared strange cheese feels almost sacred. The barkeep walks by and chuckles. Still warm. Huh, he says. Though you're not sure if he means the cheese or the air between you. You smile anyway, because tonight you got cheese, and in the Wild West, that means you're winning. At some point, you stop asking what things are and start asking what they've been through. That's how it is with the pickled food. It arrives on your plate with no context, no garnish, no explanation. just sitting there in a cloudy puddle of brine like it dares you to guess. A sausage, maybe. Or a pepper. Or something less easily categorized. It glistens, it wiggles, and it stares back. You prod it with your fork. It shifts slightly, revealing a label on the jar behind the counter that reads, in handwriting too rushed to trust maybe pork, and yet you eat it, because that's what you do out here. Pickled food in the Wild West wasn't about flavor. It was about preservation. Salt and vinegar were some of the only tools saloon cooks had to fight against heat, time, and the very concept of spoilage. If it could be shoved into a jar and made to float, it might last through the summer, or the winter, or the next 3 presidents. Cabbage, onions, sausages, eggs, anything that didn't move fast enough. The end result was rarely attractive, never delicate, but safe. Probably. Cowboys didn't ask what brine was made of. They just hoped it was strong enough to kill whatever lived in the food before it got there. You take a bite, it crunches with a snap loud enough to make the gambler 3 tables over look up. You chew, it's salty, sharp, a little rubbery, but you're still alive, so that's a win. There's an infamous story of a man who bit into a pickled sausage and found a small bone. Not a big one, not dangerous. Just unexpected. He didn't flinch, didn't complain. He finished the sausage, called it textured, and went back to his card game. That's the frontier attitude. Pickled things were the saloon's answer to dessert. Not because they were sweet, though, sometimes, in strange attempts at variety. They were soaked in sugary brine, but because they were rare. Odd. A break from the endless stew and scorched beans. A flavor strong enough to make you feel something again, even if that feeling was confusion. One cook reportedly kept a surprise jar under the counter, filled with whatever scraps were left at the end of the week. You didn't order from it. You just got handed something from it when the kitchen was tired of your face. The taste was unpredictable. The outcome, consistent customers left humbled, sometimes. The pickled things were vibrant red beets staining everything pink, yellow peppers glowing like lanterns, eggs turned strange and rubbery. But most of the time, they were brownish-green blobs, warped by weeks in brine, unrecognizable even to the man who made them. Still, they lasted. Historians say pickling was more than just a necessity. It was insurance. In a world without refrigeration, pickled food was the closest thing to a safety net. It was the saloon's way of saying, we may not have fresh, but we have something. And that meant survival. You finished half your plate. You still don't know what you're eating, but you're strangely okay with it. There's a certain rhythm to pickled food. You take a bite, squint slightly, chase it with whiskey, then sit very still to see what happens. If nothing happens within 5 minutes, you declare it a success. A few saloons even got famous for their pickled items. One in Kansas sold something called devil's tongue, which was either a pepper or a very angry root. Men would challenge each other to eat it whole. The losers sometimes wept. The winners sometimes hallucinated. Either way, it was entertainment. Another saloon in Arizona had a jar simply labeled, "Don't." It sat in the corner, never moved, always full. No one ever saw anyone refill it. It was said that if you ate from that jar, the cook would shake your hand. No one ever wanted the handshake. The barkeep walks by, sees your face, and chuckles. Still twitching. Then it's fresh, he says. You nod. Words feel unnecessary. Pickled food wasn't supposed to delight you. It was supposed to remind you that you could endure, that you could put strange, quivering things into your mouth and not perish immediately, that your body was stronger than your mind gave it credit for. There's a strange kind of pride in that. You finish the plate, not out of hunger, but out of stubbornness. Across the saloon, someone holds up a jar and shakes it. The contents slosh ominously. A few cowboys cheer. A few leave. You stay, because now you understand. Pickled food isn't a side dish. It's a challenge, a rite of passage. And tonight, you passed. You've been here long enough to know who really runs this place, and it's not the man behind the bar. It's the cook. You've only caught glimpses of him, usually behind a veil of steam and profanity. He moves like a bear with bad knees and worse patience, wielding a ladle that could double as a war club. His apron, if you can call it that, is a mosaic of past meals and past mistakes. His hair is wild, his stare wilder, and no one, not even the sheriff, tells him what to do. Because in this corner of the Wild West, the cook is the closest thing to a god or a demon. There is no in-between. You hear him before you see him, a clang, a hiss, a muffled curse. Then the unmistakable sound of something large and wet being slapped onto something hot and metal. He's back there now, behind the curtain that marks the saloon kitchen, not a door, just a frayed canvas stained with grease, soot, and stories. He hasn't come out yet today. That's either a good sign or a very bad one. Some say he used to be a butcher, others a soldier. One tale claims he was once a preacher who lost his faith after cooking beans for 50 men in a rainstorm. No one knows the truth, and no one asks. What matters is this: every plate that leaves that curtain has his mark on it. And whether it heals or harms depends entirely on his mood. You once saw a man complain about his stew, said it was too watery. The cook came out, handed him the ladle, and told him to try again on himself. The man ate in silence after that, because the cook's wrath wasn't theatrical. It was quiet, inevitable, like gravity. He wasn't rude. He just didn't need anyone's approval. He was the food. And if you didn't like it, well, there was always the door or the desert. The strange thing is, sometimes he gets it right. Unforgettably right. There are nights when the bread is warm, the beans are soft, the pork is only mildly resentful, and the stew tastes like it might contain hope. On those nights, the saloon hums with something close to peace. No one mentions it. That would ruin the spell. But glances are exchanged. Chewing slows down. And everyone, even the most hardened drifter, sits a little straighter. That's the mark of a cook who's chosen kindness for now. And that's rare enough to be sacred. He steps out now, into the dim light of the saloon. A hush falls. Soft, but real. He doesn't speak, just scans the room, checking the faces, the plates, the pace of chewing. You look up. He meets your eye for half a second, then he turns and disappears. You exhale, because the cook saw you and chose not to smite you. You take another bite, more gratefully this time. Some believe saloon cooks were half mad, driven to the brink by the never-ending demand, the heat, the noise, the endless parade of drunks and gamblers asking for something hot and nothing weird. Others think they were artists, trapped in the wrong time, using whatever tools they had to create something close to meaning. Historians can't agree. Some point to diary entries praising a saloon cook's biscuits. Others cite letters home describing slop with the emotional weight of war trauma. But they all agree on one thing. The cook had power, real power, not the kind that carries a badge or a gun. The kind that controls when and if you eat. The kind that decides whether your last meal was worth remembering or regretting. You once heard a story about a cook who served the same soup for 3 weeks straight. He didn't change the recipe. He didn't clean the pot. He just kept adding to it. Whatever came in, meat, bone, salt, fat went in. Some say the flavor became richer. Others say it became sentient. When someone asked him what it was called, he said, Thursday. It was a Monday. The cook doesn't need validation. He doesn't need applause. He doesn't need you to like the food. He just needs you to eat it. Stay quiet and leave a clean plate. That's the deal. And it's a fair one. Because out here, survival doesn't come with seasoning. It comes with steam, grease, and decisions made behind a curtain no one wants to look behind. You finish your meal. It wasn't perfect. The beans were a little too firm. The meat was ambiguous. But it was warm. It was filling. It didn't bite you back. And in this place, under this roof, that's enough to count as grateful. You hear the clang of another pan, a hiss of fire meeting something wet, a low hum he's singing now, maybe, and just like that, your opinion doesn't matter anymore, because the cook is back at work, shaping destiny with a spoon and a frown, feeding the lost and the tired and the nameless, and deciding, once again, who walks away smiling, and who walks away steaming. After enough time on the frontier, you begin to understand something most city folk never will. Food doesn't need to be beautiful. It just needs to hold you together. And by the 13th meal, the 13th sunrise, and maybe the 13th time you've cursed your life decisions over a bowl of something brown and ambiguous, it starts to dawn on you. You're not eating for pleasure. You're eating for fuel, for heat, for survival. Tonight, your dinner is a stew again. Of course it is. There's always stew. But something about the way it's ladled into your bowl, steaming like it's been boiling since last winter, reminds you of why you sit at this crooked table every night, instead of giving up and sleeping on a rock under the stars, because it's warm, because it weighs something. Because out here, when the dust coats your throat and the sun burns your shoulders raw, a hot, heavy meal, no matter how unappetizing, is a kind of mercy. You blow on your spoonful. The heat rises in little waves, fogging the corners of your eyes. The smell isn't good, but it's consistent, and that, more than anything, tells you you're still alive. The man 2 tables down has lost a boot. He's chewing with his foot up, wrapped in a rag. The woman near the door has a gun on her lap and a baby in her arms, and both look like they might scream at any moment. But they're eating. Slowly, methodically. Because hunger, out here, doesn't care about pride. And you're thinking about what your body's been through just to get to this bowl of stew. 40 miles on horseback. A sunburn on your neck. Dust between your teeth. And that silent, constant question that hovers behind every decision, will this be enough to keep going? Food in the Wild West wasn't about celebration. It wasn't even about satisfaction. It was resistance against weather, against time, against every part of you that wanted to sit down and never get up again. And that's why the meals were heavy. They had to be. Historically, cowboys and drifters burned thousands of calories a day riding, wrangling, working, and saloons were among the few places that could provide dense, filling food fast. High in salt, fat, and bulk. Every meal was designed to land in your gut like a sandbag and stay there. Not fancy. Just functional. You needed strong teeth, a stronger stomach, and the kind of hunger that overpowered your taste buds. A stew might have the consistency of mud and the color of despair. But if it kept your knees from buckling on the trail, it did its job. And so, people kept coming back. There was no room for allergies or dietary preferences. If you asked for no onions, you were met with laughter. If you refused to eat what was served, you simply didn't eat. There was no fallback plan, no snack bar, just the same stew, the same beans, the same meat-shaped surprise. Sometimes it helped not to look. You stared at the horizon instead, or at the bottom of your cup, or at someone else's plate. Just long enough to remind yourself at least mine's still warm. There are accounts of people eating things they couldn't identify, even after finishing. "I think it was meat," one man wrote. But then again, so is a boot. If you boil it long enough, you learn to stop asking questions. Your meal is halfway gone now. Your jaw aches a little from the chewing. You're back from the long ride. But your stomach is quiet. And in a place like this, that silence is golden. The cook has gone back behind the curtain. You hear the soft scrape of ladle on pot, the fire crackling, the hiss of something hitting the pan. And in that noise, there's a rhythm slow, unhurried, deeply human. Everyone in the saloon is chewing at different tempos. But you're all doing the same thing, rebuilding yourselves from the inside out, spoon by spoon, bite by bite. There's a debate among frontier historians about how much of this food was even digestible. Some say the meals caused more harm than good. Others argue that the human body, when properly desperate, can adapt to nearly anything. They might all be right, or none of them. But you're here, and you're eating. And tonight, that feels like proof enough. A storm is rolling in outside now. You can hear the wind clawing at the shingles, rattling the wooden slats like bones in a tin. Someone puts another log on the fire. The warmth spreads, creeping into your boots, softening the ache in your spine. The saloon begins to glow, not brightly, but steadily. And your meal, your hot, heavy, questionably legal stew, starts to feel less like punishment and more like peace. You sip from your cup. The liquid burns slightly. Coffee, tea, you don't care. It's warm, and it stays down. Around you, no one speaks. There's no need. Hunger is a language, and so is survival. And out here, you're fluent in both. You scrape the last of the stew from the bowl. The ladle clangs in the pot again. Someone stands to leave, adjusting their hat, stepping out into the storm. The door bangs open and closed behind them, but you stay, because the chair is soft, the bowl is warm, and for once, your bones aren't screaming. And that, in a land where nothing comes easy, is what a good meal really means. No one walks into a Wild West saloon expecting fine dining. Not really. By now, you've learned the rules. Food here isn't art. It's armor. It doesn't ask to be enjoyed. It demands to be endured. Each meal is a kind of pact. You give it your attention, and it gives you enough strength to keep walking. But something shifts once you've eaten enough of it. You stop seeing the stew as suspicious. You stop side-eyeing the cornbread. You stop wincing before every bite of salt pork. And instead, you start to recognize it all for what it really is. Fuel. A fire inside your body, burning slow and hot to carry you from one day to the next. It's not about taste. It's about function. About feeling something solid hit your stomach and knowing that for tonight, at least, you won't collapse face first into the dust. You sit at your usual spot now, no longer waiting to be surprised by what's on the plate. The surprise stopped being fun after the fifth time something crunched that shouldn't have. Instead, you sit with quiet acceptance. You eat what arrives. You chew through it. You nod to the barkeep. And you keep moving. Because out here, every meal is a decision to keep living. And that's worth more than spice. There's something meditative about this kind of eating. A rhythm to it. A man pours his coffee. Another breaks his biscuit. A woman wipes her child's face with a sleeve that used to be white. The cutlery scrapes in time with the crackling fire. And outside, the wind howls just loud enough to remind you what's waiting if you step too far from the warmth. This is survival. Not dramatic. Not bloody. Just quiet and repetitive. And absolutely necessary. You take a bite. It's familiar now. Your taste buds, once rebellious, have resigned. This is food as function. Calories as currency. Warmth as a form of love. The meals themselves haven't changed. It's still the same beans, the same boiled meat, the same barkeep cracking the same jokes about stew thick enough to patch a roof. But something in you has shifted. You've started to see the ritual in it. The ceremony of sitting down, spoon in hand, boots unlaced just enough to breathe. Of lifting something hot to your mouth and knowing it came from a fire tended by tired hands. The kind of hands that might not say your name, but still make sure your bowl's full. Historians write about the drama of the Wild West, the gunfights, the gold rushes, the outlaws with names etched into history. But they often forget the other side of it. The quieter war, the one waged every evening at a wooden table with a dull knife and a cracked bowl. The war against hunger, against hopelessness, against giving up. And in that war, food wasn't a luxury. It was a weapon. A hot plate was as much armor as a revolver. You once met a man who hadn't eaten for 2 days, lost his horse, got turned around in the desert. Said the only reason he made it back was because he was thinking about the stew. Not the taste of it, just the heat of it, the weight of it. The way it settled in your belly and reminded your legs they could keep walking. That was all he needed to keep moving. And when he finally returned to town, he didn't ask for water. He asked for beans. They gave him 2 bowls. This kind of food doesn't get written about in cookbooks. There are no recipes passed down with pride. No handwritten notes in the margins. No secret ingredients that make it sing, because it doesn't need to sing. It just needs to stay, to cling to your ribs, hold your bones together, and whisper, "Not yet. You're not done yet." And when it does that, it becomes holy. You take another sip of coffee. Still bitter. Still burned. But it doesn't taste like punishment anymore. It tastes like persistence. A man walks past your table, heading for the door. He's got the look of someone who's eaten just enough to try again. He nods to you. You nod back. No words. Just shared understanding. Tomorrow, you'll both be back, because the trail doesn't stop, and neither can you. Somewhere behind the curtain, the cook stirs the next pot. You can hear it, the slow scrape of wood on metal, the bubbling that says something is happening, even if you're not sure what. You picture him back there, sleeves rolled, eyes tired, ladle in hand, not creating, just continuing. You don't know what tomorrow's meal will be, but you trust it'll be there, and that's enough. Because out here, enough is everything. There's a kind of silence that follows the last bite of a meal. Not just the kind where your plate is empty, but the kind where your body relaxes in slow stages, where your shoulders drop, where your breath evens out, where the warmth of what you've eaten begins to outshine the cold you carried in. That's what fills the saloon now. Not laughter, not music, not the loud clang of poker chips or the sharp crack of a revolver fired into the ceiling. Just a hush, a kind of peace that food, even this food, can sometimes buy. Your spoon sits at the bottom of the bowl. There's nothing left to chase. The broth is gone. The crust of bread is a memory. The burn of salt pork has faded from your tongue. And even the bitter sting of the coffee has mellowed into something strangely soothing. For a brief moment, you feel whole. Around the room, others feel it too. One man leans back, hat pulled over his face, snoring quietly. Another pushes his plate away and lights a pipe with fingers that tremble from more than just the cold. The barkeep leans his weight against the bar, watching, measuring, calculating who'll need a refill and who's done for the night. You sit still, because you're not quite ready to leave this moment. It's strange, isn't it? How a place like this dusty, greasy, half-lit saloon with floors that creak and flies that never leave, can come to feel like shelter. Not because it's safe, not because it's kind, but because it's predictable, because it feeds you, warms you, tells you that you're still here. This food, for all its mystery and menace, has given you something real. It has filled your belly and reminded you of your body's quiet resilience. It has carried you through fatigue and fear, through nights when the fire nearly went out, through mornings where your boots felt heavier than your heart. It has shown you that hunger isn't always an enemy. Sometimes, it's just a voice reminding you that you still want to live, and every spoonful that answered it, that was a victory. You once heard a preacher say that the soul doesn't live in the head, but in the stomach. At the time, you laughed. Now, you're not so sure. Because there's something undeniably spiritual about surviving this place, this life, with nothing more than grit. Grit-filled stew, and the kind of calories that come with consequences. There's something holy about swallowing pain in the form of food and walking away with strength instead of shame. And maybe, just maybe, that's what the saloon has always offered. Not gourmet cooking, not fine service, but communion, a shared table for the broken, the brave, and the barely hanging on. You stand now, slowly, joints creaking, muscles murmuring. The food settles heavy in your gut, but not unpleasantly. It's an anchor, a comfort, a fire that'll keep you burning just a little while longer. You leave a coin on the table, more than required, less than deserved. Because how do you pay for survival? You nod once to the barkeep. He nods back. You push through the swinging doors, the cool night air meeting your face like a slap and a kiss all at once. The stars overhead are too many to count. The moon hangs low, full, glowing like a second sun, dulled by fatigue. And you keep walking. Tomorrow, you'll eat again. It'll be beans, or stew, or a crust of hardtack softened with whiskey and regret. And it will be enough, because it always has been. And somehow, out here, enough is the closest thing to salvation you'll ever taste. You find your way back to wherever you're staying, a cot, a stable loft, a quiet corner of someone's floor. The wind outside sighs through the slats of the building, and the world grows a little quieter with each passing moment. Your body is heavier now, but it's a good kind of heavy. The kind that says you made it through the day. The kind that says you have been fed, warmed, and witnessed. Somewhere deep in your core, beneath the ache in your legs and the grit on your skin, there's a softness returning, a calm. You lie down. The blanket scratches. The air smells of wood smoke and earth, and maybe something pickled that refuses to leave. But you are still. You are whole. And with each breath, you drift a little further from the noise of the saloon, the clang of cutlery, the murmur of voices. You float back through the last meal through beans and bread and stew and something vaguely meat-shaped, and none of it seems so harsh now. None of it seems strange. It just seems real. Because the Wild West wasn't carved by heroes. It was carried by the hungry, the tired, the stubborn souls who sat at tables like yours and found reasons to keep going. One rough meal at a time. So rest now. The fire's low. The world is still. You are safe. You are full. And tomorrow, there will be more stories, more dust, more footsteps, and, of course, more stew. But for tonight, close your eyes. Let it all go. You're home now.